Ina reo, ina mana, kuia ma, koruma, hui hui nei. Tēnei aki mihi mihana kia koutou. I aku rangateras, o ngā mihi kia koutou. Ngā mihi e te whānau te manawa nui a kiwa. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou kātou. Well, welcome everyone to this webinar. My name is Peter Kelly, and I will commence proceedings with a karakia. E whātaro ana tinako, kia rātou o tā wāhina, kia tau mai nei te manakitanga, ki runga, ki tēnei hui huina, ta wharautia mātou i te kākahu takitaki, o te mana atua, o te mana ariki. Tūturu kia rongo whakamoa kia tīna, huie tai kia. Welcome everyone, and I'll now hand us over to our MC for this afternoon. Thank you.
Tēnā koe Peter, and thank you for your welcome. Pacific greetings everyone. Welcome to our attendees from Aotearoa and across the broad Pacific and into Asia. This is a very important event for Transparency International New Zealand. And I'll now refer to them as TINZ as it launches this major piece of research, the Corruption and Money Laundering in the Pacific, Intertwined Challenges and Interlinked Responses report, which started last year and now presented to you. TINZ hopes this research will contribute to greater fairness, transparency and integrity for the peoples of the Pacific. And we have had well over 100 registrations for this event with representation coming from Pacific parliaments and Pacific government agencies, from New Zealand government agencies, from the private sector and from the non-governmental organizations, including our friends in the Pacific and Transparency International chapters and local members. You're all most welcome. Just a little bit about myself. My name is Toleafoa Alfred Schuster. I'm a member of TINZ, but also on my professional background has been in education, in public policy and diplomacy, with work experience in the Pacific in intergovernmental organizations such as the Pacific Islands Forum, with the United Nations, and now a Pacific consultant here in Aotearoa. So just a few housekeeping matters first. You'll note that this webinar will be recorded and you will all be sent the recording link once it is ready. You will see that you can see the panel and can use the Q&A function, and we do encourage everyone to post questions that you might have that we can then present to the panel once they've provided their presentation and we've been able to get a clear idea of the findings and recommendations of this important piece of work. Also note that you're all muted and with your videos off, but we do know that you are there, so don't hesitate to, again, pose questions if you have some. And just to acknowledge VidCom, who are running the tech for this event. So I'll now just hand over to Julie. But before that, I'll just give you a quick rundown of our format. Julie Hagee is the CEO of Transparency International New Zealand. She'll give us a quick rundown of what TINZ does, for those who don't know, and of where this project sits in the TINZ programs of work. We will then hear from Professor John Hopkins, who was the lead researcher in this report. He will take us through the research findings and recommendations, which is really the crux of what we are here to find out more about. We will then hear from Marie Koshua-Peji from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime in the Pacific in Fiji. And she will talk briefly about how this research aligns with the work of UNODC. And lastly, we will hear from Joseph Veramu, who is the Executive Director at Integrity Fiji, which is in the process of being accredited as a chapter of Transparency International. And Joseph will talk about how the Pacific civil society organizations can engage with regulators and advocate for greater business transparency. We will then open the floor for questions, and we do have an additional member of the panel, and while they won't be presenting, they will be available to respond to some of your questions, and that's Nguyen, who is also a co-author of this report and was very much a part of the research team that compiled its findings. We'll then have a final wrap up from John. And so at this point, I'll just hand over now to Julie to take us through some of the work of Transparency International New Zealand. Over to you, Julie.
Kia ora, Alfred, and thank you very much. It's so good to see everybody here and see the great number of participants. Welcome to you all, you're most welcome. This report is we started last year, and it's great to have it out. It's aimed out into the Pacific, but also with an eye to the funding agencies and the aid agencies, because there's certainly some more support that could be given there as well. And also, but to the regulators and to people in the Pacific, and also to NGOs. Next slide, thanks. I just want to tell you a little bit about what Transparency International does. We're one chapter of a global organisation that is an anti-corruption organisation, which promotes transparency, accountability and integrity as antidotes to corruption. On the left-hand side of this table, you'll see that's our current sort of main areas of focus: protecting the public resources, stopping flows of dirty money, securing integrity in politics and public sector, driving integrity in business, expanding the civil space for accountability, and building community leadership against corruption. This project fits under the stop flows of dirty money, because like our work on beneficial ownership, and we have been a strong advocate on that, open registers for beneficial ownership in New Zealand. Like that, this is a way of stopping the corrupt using systems in order to transfer their proceeds around. And so you'll see on the right, that's the sort of things that we're doing to affect those aims on the left. And so we do procurement data monitoring, we run integrity assessments. They're all there, and they're certainly available for you to have a look at on our website if you want to have a look, on our annual reports and and also in our newsletters, which I encourage you to join up with. Have a look on our website. Next slide, thanks. The other thing is that we're part of a global movement, and the global movement has produced some really important reports, some of which you will know of and others you may not have. The Corruption Perceptions Index is probably the most known in New Zealand, but it's not so well known in some other places. And New Zealand scores very well on that, although we do have our problems. Another important report is the Corruption Barometer, and just last year the Transparency International produced the Pacific Corruption Barometer, which Corruption Barometer is where ordinary people are asked for their experience and views on corruption, and that interviewed 6,000 people across 10 Pacific nations. That report was released in November, but it's still there's lots of data there. It's still providing a rich source of information for researchers and for advocates and for parliaments. The other one, Defence Integrity Index, which New Zealand was covered by the late last year, and this one, Money Laundering Corruption. So you can see the connections between them. Next slide, thanks. Just finishing with a picture, but this is the front cover of the Pacific Corruption Barometer report, and it does have relevance to this discussion as well, because in that report, people reported quite high levels of corruption, having paid bribes, sextortion, being offered bribes for votes, and across a range of Pacific Islands. So it's another important data source that's useful for civil society and also for the people in the Pacific themselves. So that's it from me. We'd just like to acknowledge the organisations that funded the project. It was fundamentally funded by MFAT and DFAT, from Foreign Affairs from New Zealand and Australia. And they funded into a pool of money that went through Transparency International Global, which then contracted us to provide a research project back to it. So I think it's a clear value given out from the aid dollar as well. So thanks very much. I'll close off here and hand back to Alfred.
Alofa tai, Julie. So that gives you an outline of and evidence of the good work that Transparency International does. And I do encourage those of you here that are not members to become either individual or corporate members of this very worthy organization. At this point, if I could just acknowledge the members of the TINZ, including our TINZ patron, the Right Honourable Patsy Reddy, the TINZ board, staff and members with delegated authority. I'd now like to introduce Professor John Hopkins, who was the lead researcher in this work. And before I do, just to give you a brief outline of Professor Hopkins, he's a comparative public lawyer who specializes in anti-corruption and disaster law. In the field of anti-corruption, Professor Hopkins currently leads an international European Union funded project examining anti-corruption mechanisms in the South Pacific region in a comparative context. He was the lead New Zealand author of the TI Exporting Corruption Report of 2018 and 2020, and served on the board of Transparency International New Zealand from 2017 to 2020. And so on that note, I invite Professor Hopkins to take us through the report.
Apologies, I have, I'll just get to the... Thank you very much. My apologies for that. Kia ora koutou, ahi ahi, and thank you very much for the chance to speak to you today. I'm, as you just heard, Dr. John Hopkins tene. I'm a professor of law here at the University of Canterbury, and along with my colleague Chat Nguyen, we are delighted to present this report for you today. Just as a brief background, as you heard, my background is in anti-corruption, and Chat is an anti-money laundering expert. Chat used to work at the University of South Pacific and the National University of Fiji. So hopefully we were able to bring this combined expertise to the table. I also at this point want to thank our research assistant Talia Siataga, who provided some excellent assistance as the project developed. So what we want to do,
John, sorry to interrupt you. Sorry to interrupt you. Just that your screen is not showing the PowerPoint.
If you could
thank you. Just cross-check that. Thank you. Yep,
thank
perfect.
You. Terribly sorry about that. Had a bit of a technical hitch. So my where were we? Yes, so I was the aim today is to give you a short overview of the report and the some of the key findings that we concluded and some of the recommendations. So as a bit of a background to the project itself, we had two main aims, as three listed on the screen, but in basically to map and assess the risks, the legal and policy frameworks that exist across the Pacific to deal with corruption and money laundering. And the key point we want to make here is that these subjects, corruption and money laundering, are huge, and both in the Pacific context and globally. And our aim was to look at the nexus between them, and that's what this report attempts to do. In addition to assessing to mapping the framework and assessing its effectiveness, we wanted to recognize best practice in the region and provide some recommendation to inform future policy. I would emphasize at this stage that there is best practice in the region, there are many elements of the implementation of anti-money laundering and anti-corruption nexus that I think should be lauded, and we should identify those. But there are also areas that we think there could be areas of improvement, or we would suggest areas for future thought and policy development. In terms of method, we started by providing a frame through the global and regional anti-corruption and anti-money laundering regimes, which we then applied to 7 case study analysis, 7 case study Pacific Island country analyses. Those Pacific Island countries, which I'll return to in a second, were chosen specifically to give an idea, to give an overall reflection of the region and its different economic and social differences. The other thing to emphasize at this point is that this was very much a desktop study. We found with the difficulties of COVID, it was very difficult to undertake in-country research, and although we attempted to develop some in-country contacts, that also was difficult to do. However, Chat and I have a number of informal contacts, and we used reviewers and others to clarify and to confirm our findings. So we're confident that even given the limitations that COVID presented, that the report is largely accurate. So just to start, we need to lay down very briefly what we're talking about here in terms of corruption and money laundering. And as I suggested before, what our focus is very much upon the nexus between them. Strange as it may seem to many lay people, there's no international agreement on the generic definition of a generic definition of corruption. You've probably heard Transparency International's global definition, which has received a lot of coverage generally, which is the use of public office for private gain. And we've tended to use that in that broad definition in this report. But just to be clear that the key international document, which we do use to frame our study, doesn't actually define corruption at all. Instead, it uses examples of how the proceeds of corruption might be generated, some of them listed on the slide there. Money laundering is a little bit more simple, and it's generally accepted. We've used the American President's Commission on Organized Crime definition, the process by which one conceals the existence of an illegal source or illegal application of income. And then you disguise that income, obviously, to make it appear legitimate so that it's not subject to sanctions by the authorities. Now, although to most people, I think, the link between the corruption and money laundering is obvious, as we'll see in a second, the legal frameworks around this are actually quite disparate, and that's one of the problems. The proceeds of the link between corruption and money laundering, excuse me, are many. There's lots of different ways that these link together in this nexus. But the obvious point is that the proceeds of corruption are often disguised and laundered through typologies by various corrupt officials and individuals. Money launderers may bribe law enforcement officials. They may do the same to legal professionals to allow them to actually hide their financial ill-gotten gains. Corrupt officials also don't want to implement anti-money laundering regimes. The reason for this is simple: that an effective anti-money laundering regime will often expose corruption. And this is one of the things we'll talk about in a second, that the anti-money laundering schemes, although they're often seen as separate from anti-corruption, actually have an important part to play in exposing corrupt activities. There's also the wider point that corruption undermines the general willingness or ability of states to fight money laundering. So there is a close connection between them. The other point, as I've just said, is that on the flip side is that anti-money laundering mechanisms and laws can be very effective as a tool to expose and limit corruption as well. Now, this may be relatively obvious to most individuals who would see these connections, but it's perhaps surprising to discover that in the legal sphere, we actually have two distinct legal frameworks that deal with corruption and money laundering. And this can be a bit of a problem. So on the one side, we've got the treaty, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption Treaty, which is the main anti-corruption treaty. And that's hard law. It criminalizes corruption as a predicate crime of money laundering. It requires states to undertake actions to prevent money laundering, for example, beneficial owner identification and record keeping. And it also requires states to develop suspicious transaction reporting systems, so-called STRs, in their legal frameworks. But this is very much, these are small aspects that deal with money laundering, but this is a convention that is largely focused on corruption. It's also a treaty, so its details are, it's not a particularly detailed requirements. The actual details are left to the state party on how they're going to deliver them. We can contrast that with the main money laundering initiative, international initiative or agency, which is the Financial Action Task Force. Unlike the UNCAC, this is not a treaty, it's an informal soft law, a so-called soft law agency. It doesn't produce hard restrictions or hard law. However, the recommendations of the FATF have extreme force, because if individual states don't implement them, they risk being grey or blacklisted. So the distinction of the two regimes isn't that great in practice. For our purposes, the FATF is crucial because it provides much more detailed requirements for states around, particularly around money laundering, but of course, in relation to anti-corruption. In particular, it requires customer due diligence requirements, more specific record-keeping obligations, so in line with the UN treaty. It also requires confiscation, legal confiscation rules around the proceeds of corruption, and it recognizes the concept of politically exposed persons, so-called PEPs. Now, this is a crucial definition, particularly in the anti-corruption field, because these politically exposed individuals, who could be political leaders or leaders of public entities, are those who are most at risk of being either the subject of corruption or indeed the focus of corruption themselves. Key to this, to the recommendations of the FATF, is recommendation 10, which deals with financial institutions and designated non-financial business and professions, which has the awkward acronym of DNFBPS. Acronyms are incredibly common in this field, they're very frustrating. But these designated non-financial businesses are things like lawyers or real estate agents, or maybe even casinos, where significant financial flows come through them, but they're not designated specifically as financial institutions, incidental to their primary function. But these bodies and financial institutions have to take, under recommendation 10, take enhanced precautions when they deal with PEPs and their associates and families, and anti-corruption agencies must effectively share information. Now, the reason I draw attention to these two international legal frameworks is that this is the frame with which we apply to our case studies in our study of the Pacific region. And to do that, we studied 7 states, Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Tonga, Samoa, Cook Islands, and Vanuatu. The reason we chose them is to get a broad overview of different types of states and the sort of corruption and money laundering risk that they face. Fiji is a relatively developed financial, has a relatively developed financial sector, but in contrast, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and Tonga, much smaller. Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands in particular, of course, have significant problems with internal corruption, as we've seen recently in the Pacific Barometer report that Julie mentioned a few minutes ago. And finally, Samoa, the Cook Islands, and Vanuatu are all states who have developed offshore financial centers, which of course can be an issue for international money laundering. We took the 7 states and then looked at, we did 5 elements in the mapping. We looked at the national context of corruption and money laundering. We looked at the legal and institutional responses. We looked at preventive measures, confiscation of corruption proceeds, and finally, finance intelligence units. So let's turn to the report's comments itself, or the findings itself. Well, the first point to make is, of course, that corruption and money laundering are an issue in the Pacific, and this is something that should not come as a surprise to most of the people listening today. Unfortunately, as we're aware, and again, as the Pacific Barometer made clear, the recently published Pacific Barometer has made clear, corruption is prevalent in most Pacific Island countries. And it links with money laundering through a variety of different mechanisms. I won't go into detail of all these because of issues of time, but to highlight that the proceeds generated for corruption in countries with undeveloped financial sectors are laundered overseas. You get transnational money laundering is an issue there. We also have the fact that countries with a history of operating as offshore financial centers are known to be attractive to the proceeds of foreign corruption, and there have been cases, as you can see in the report, that have been recorded in those states. And finally, one that's not quite so often picked up is that the use of the cash-based economy in a number of these states can itself prove a useful way of money laundering and corrupt activities, of the finances from corrupt activities. So when we analyze the actual responses to these problems across the Pacific, what did we find? Well, we found on the positive side, we found that most states have pretty sound legal frameworks when it comes to their response to corruption and money laundering. They're not perfect, but I would say that certainly from my own work studying other states outside the region in anti-corruption, I don't think the Pacific legal frameworks, actually, they all hold up pretty well in comparison with other frameworks outside the region. There are some specific exceptions that could be improved, and I'll talk a little bit about that again in a second, particularly around PEPs, that's those politically exposed persons. It would be good to have those, some of those loopholes or rather loose requirements tightened. And in particular, some states have quite narrow definitions of politically exposed persons, which I think would be better to expand them to include a wider group. Now, then that leads us with a question, because if the legal and policy responses have been relatively good, then where are the problems? What are the issues that are stopping them being so effective? Well, we drew a number of conclusions, but they can be summarized here. Again, you can read more in the report. Firstly, the application of existing mechanisms is not as effective as one would like. Secondly, that limited resources are being applied to the investigation and prosecution of money laundering and anti-corruption. Thirdly, that the financial intelligence units, the FIUs, there appears to be poor use of their intelligence, or in some cases, a lack of analysis by the information that the FIUs are getting, or indeed they're not receiving the information, but problems around the FIUs. And finally, a lack of coordination between national anti-money laundering and anti-corruption bodies. So to try and address this, we came up with a few recommendations that states may wish to consider moving forward to try and deal with this nexus between money laundering and corruption. The first is, as I mentioned a few slides ago, that those elements of the legal and policy frameworks that require strengthening should be focused upon, and particularly in relation to customer due diligence and beneficial ownership. So ensuring that individuals are who they say they are, and that the record keeping is the standard required. This is particularly true of PEPs, where there is the possibility of such records, of such people avoiding the scrutiny that should be undertaken, enhanced scrutiny that should apply. Secondly, that there should be consideration of a development of the financial confiscation tools that exist across the states examined. Now, we did find that the tools do exist, but they're, without exception, they're conviction-based. They tend to be, they take a long time to operate, and they're not often used. So in relation to that, there needs to be, that we would suggest the development of strategies to focus on the proceeds of corruption through such tools, because if those engaged in corruption cannot get the financial benefits of it, then they will cease to do it. We also think that the financial investigation units need improved resourcing, staffing, and improved capacity. Financial intelligence units, my apologies. And in many cases, improved use of the intelligence that they do produce, because in some cases that it is of good quality. It's just the use that doesn't seem to be as effective as it might be. Then also this issue of, as we mentioned before, the fact that the money laundering and corruption tend to be seen as separate issues needs to be addressed, and we would suggest this can be addressed through more cross-agency investigations or models or agencies or task forces, whichever model the Pacific states themselves wish to consider. There are some examples of successful models in the Pacific, and some are mentioned in the report, and we suggest they could be followed. There's also the fact that we think that anti-money laundering regulators should be aware of the anti-corruption risks, particularly that exist for PEPs, so they can assist their anti-corruption colleagues. And finally, we believe there's a need to increase capacity and generally improve the amount of cross-border cooperation in anti-corruption and anti-money laundering in a way to stop illegal flows across the region. That's really all I have to say at the moment, but the one thing I would finally comment on is that these improvements have to be, or these recommendations would have to be implemented by the states themselves in ways that fit with their own cultural and legal models. This is not a question of one size fits all, but hopefully this will give some guidance to developing individual responses to these problems across Pacific states. Ka kite anō, thank you for your time.
Oops. Kia ora there. Just while Alfred is coming back on, thanks very much, John. It's been fantastic and a really good presentation of the facts. Now, just to let people know that the actual slides will be available, as well as the link to the recording afterwards. I think we might head through now to. Unless Alfred, are you ready to come back on board as the MC?
Yes, apologies, Julia, and apologies to everyone. Just some minor hiccups here in Tamaki Makaurau. But just to acknowledge again, John, and Maroa Pito for your presentation. Just a reminder to everyone that we have the tab for questions and answers, so we do encourage everyone to provide what questions you may have. We've tried to respond, and we've answered some where we can. Questions already posed by some of you, so thank you for that. And we hope that the responses are what you're seeking. We will provide a link to the report once we've officially launched it, and it will also be available on the TINZ website on www.transparency.org.nz. Our next speaker, we'll move on to our next speaker now, is Marie Koshua-Peji, who is the Regional Anti-Corruption Advisor with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. She's also the officer in charge in the Pacific, based in Suva, Fiji, and has been there since September of 2021. Prior to this role, she worked in Myanmar as the Anti-Corruption Program Manager from 2018 to 2021. And before joining UNODC, she was part of the UN Peacekeeping Operations Rapidly Deployable Teams, where she was deployed to the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan in 2014, and also to MINUSCA, which is the integrated or multidimensional integrated stabilization mission in the Central African Republic in 2016 and 2017. She was also part of the rapidly deployable team in the UN Assistance Mission in Somalia in 2017. She's worked on legal aid and access to justice, and then operationalizing the Special Criminal Court, or the Hybrid Criminal Court for War Crimes, in the Central African Republic. She's also joined expert missions in Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, Cyprus, and Kosovo. Marie, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks to Transparency International New Zealand to have extended me the invitation for the launch of this very important research. I'll start here by a quote from the UN Secretary General: "Corruption is the ultimate betrayal of public trust." And with that in mind, I'd like to present some of the work that we've done on money laundering, but also the larger picture in relation to where does it fit into the regional framework. We know the Pacific Roadmap to address corruption in the region is the Tinua vision, and it draws on the UNCAC Convention, which is the first legally binding global anti-corruption instrument, where actually the 14 Pacific Island countries have adhered to. And it's also linked to the SDG 16. So the UNCAC criminalizes not only basic form of corruption, such as bribery and embezzlement of public funds, but also trading in influence and concealment and laundering of the proceeds of corruption. And in view of the importance of combating money laundering in the fight against corruption, the convention requires states parties to criminalize the laundering of the proceeds of crime through Article 23, and to adopt measures to prevent money laundering through Article 14 and 52, and also encourages the establishment of financial intelligence units through Article 14 and 58. In 2020, the Tinua vision was adopted and developed as the first Pacific Regional Anti-Corruption Conference. In February 2021, the 18 Pacific Island Forum leaders formally endorsed the adoption of the Tinua vision as the forum regional commitment to progress Pacific unity against corruption. And as the Secretary of the Pacific Island Forum, Andrew Puna, highlighted in an event last year, the moment where the signatures are done and leaders walk away is the point at which the real work begins. And we all know that work, anti-corruption work can be painstakingly slow. And we face setbacks and require collaboration from part of the society that may not speak to each other or want to work together. So with that in mind, it was important to look at the operationalization of the Tinua vision, to look also where there are priorities. And one of the priorities was combating money laundering. So we'll go to the next slide and look at what has been done and how does it link to this. So combating money laundering is aligned to operative paragraph of the Tinubu vision, and it's also linked to the UNCAC review recommendation of the Pacific. And I'd like to go into more details for an area of interest for us, all of us today: financial investigation and the link of confiscation of proceeds of corruption, asset recovery. And we've heard before, the legislative framework is more or less okay, and there might be some changes in relation to PEP, for example, or perhaps implementation of beneficial ownership, but it's really where the issue lies is how to use those investigative capacities that you have in the law to really confiscate proceeds of crime and to investigate where the money goes. And we know there is country lose billions of dollars each year through bribery, misappropriation of funds, or other corrupt practice. And much of those proceeds find safe haven in the World Financial Center. And we've heard there are some of those safe haven or those financial centers in the region. And those criminal flows are a drain on social services and economic development program. And it's everywhere. It's not specific to the Pacific. They might be using some of the haven in the Pacific, but it would have an impact largely. So how authority handle evidence, interview witnesses, and navigate the financial aspect of the case is crucial to the success of this investigation, outcome of the ensuing trial. So we need to help those investigators who are the vanguard of any corruption cases to strengthen their capacity to investigate cases and to make the link between corruption and money laundering. And UNODC, and also through the UNPRAC, the UN Pacific Regional Anti-Corruption Program, has provided training and has developed key new knowledge products. So for example, and just to name a few, we did some work on training on financial investigations and prosecution with anti-money laundering focus, to support asset recovery efforts in Palau with a participant from Federal States of Micronesia, Republic of the Marshall Islands, Papua New Guinea, and Palau. And we also provided training for police academy in the Federal States of Micronesia and Vanuatu. And there was also work in 2017 on money laundering detection, deterrence, disruption, and prevention. And we have now a dedicated program for the Pacific on money laundering and counter-finance terrorism, which are often linked, perhaps less in the Pacific, but often in the world, focusing on the professional development of analysts and investigators. So this includes assistance in establishing a certification program for AML CFT counter-finance terrorism practitioner. And the idea is to strengthen the capacity of the Pacific countries to conduct parallel investigation to combat money laundering, predicate crime, and the financing of terrorism, thereby improving sustainable growth, rule of law, and security outcomes. And as we've said before, corruption offenses are often the most important source of illicit funding. And they are predicate offenses of money laundering. And as we mentioned before as well, institutions and countries and their collaboration between institution and country are key to address money laundering. It's difficult for one country to do it themselves. So it's important to provide a platform for law enforcement from the region and beyond actually the region to share information and knowledge. And that's with this in aim that the Globe Network was formed. And you have here the SIGIL, and it's another acronym, I'm sorry for that. So the Globe Network is for Global Operational Network of Anti-Corruption Law Enforcement Authority, and ensure that the Anti-Corruption Authority from all state parties to the UNCAC and United Nations members are able to connect with their counterparts across the globe for faster, more efficient prosecution of corrupt network and practices. And Fiji, for example, is one of the countries that has already joined the Globe Network. And it has two specific aims. It's for information exchange between frontline anti-corruption law enforcement practitioners in all countries, and also to provide, it's a one-stop virtual hub, providing the knowledge, resource, and tool needed to track, investigate, and prosecute cases of cross-border corruption. And of course, it will have a link to money laundering, and including a decision tree and secure communication channels. With this, I will pass on to my colleagues and to back to Julie Aggie. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marie, for that very insightful overview of the connections of the work of UNODC with the report. But now I'd like to bring it as to, in terms of what this all means for those outside of intergovernmental processes, and invite Joseph Veramu, who is the Executive Director of Integrity Fiji, to give his thoughts on the role of civil society in anti-corruption and anti-money laundering. So just by way of introduction, Dr. Joseph Veramu is currently working part-time as the Executive Director of Civic Leaders for Clean Transactions at CLCT, Integrity Fiji, which is linked to Transparency International, and part-time as a higher research consultant at the Fiji National University. He has worked for UNICEF as a social policy specialist and UNDP as a curriculum specialist. He holds a Bachelor of Education, a Master of Philosophy, and a PhD degree from a great university, the University of the South Pacific, and an MSc from the London South Bank University. Over to you, Dr. Veramu.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah, I was very inspired listening to Professor John Hopkins present on the research, and I sort of picked up one point about cross-border cooperation, and he did mention that the states had an important role to play in sort of moving the money laundering issues, the corruption issues, sort of to curb it or to curb corruption. Because I was talking to the director of the Fijian anti-corruption agency, FATF, and they did mention that they had worked, I think he mentioned Tuvalu, on some corruption litigation, but there were some other countries. So I thought that was good that the various anti-corruption agencies in the states are sort of working together on this. Can I go on to the second slide, please? Yes, one of the huge challenges in Fiji and the Pacific is the lack of research on corruption and anti-corruption issues. And because when we write proposals, that is something that is required for baselines, the latest research, and also for our own work on our own strategic plans and our annual corporate plans. We require the latest research to inform our strategies and the actions we can take to alleviate corruption. So we come up with ambitious strategies, but without this research, it is not really that effective. And I'm just so thankful to TI New Zealand for coming up with this research by John Hopkins on corruption and money laundering. And I understand that before this, there were two other papers that came out research in the Pacific, and one that I worked with TI New Zealand with Julie on the national integrity systems. So I think this is fantastic, and if there's a way where say universities within the Pacific region can work together with New Zealand universities, that would be fantastic. Yeah, and what I really liked was that the valuable insights that was provided by John Hopkins and Dr. Chet is also enabling CSOs in the anti-corruption space to contextualize the findings and to develop appropriate strategies for tackling money laundering and corruption, which I must say are very big issues in the Pacific. The next slide, please. Yes, I raised these salient features because yesterday we met with is it the International Foundation of Electoral Systems? They came to our office and we had a chat, and they had questions, and they were asking these questions: the vulnerabilities of Fiji and, of course, the Pacific, assessing the legal and policy mechanisms in Fiji, and how well risks are understood. So we found that this was very valuable in our responses to IFAS with this kind of research that is available. And I loved reading about the various the in-depth case studies of the 7 countries because there's no such study available. So this was just fantastic that we had this, that we had this, and it also informed our work. Because from my point of view, when we read about the work in New Zealand and in the other Pacific countries, which have very active chapters working on anti-corruption, we find that we find out about the kinds of corruption that is happening there and the kinds of strategies that they are using, and we are able to sort of use these best practices to sort of inform our own work. Yeah? So I would just like to say to thank Professor John Hopkins and Dr. Chat for the fantastic research they did. It came up with a lot of valuable insights that will greatly help us, and also to TI New Zealand. And I hope this is not the last, that we'll be able to work on more such research going forward. Thank you very much. Inaka.
Nakpakalevu, Dr. Veramu, for your insights. I'm just trying to switch on my video. Okay, that's all right. As long as you can all hear me, that's fine. So we've now come to the part of our webinar where we're opening up for questions, and I would like to just invite our panelists to please just to come back on your video cameras, your screens, and be ready for any questions that have been posed. We did have questions in the Q&A, and I understand most of them have been answered. We do have others that we'd like to put to the panel. So the first question that we have is, and I'll open this up to the panel, and please just jump in if you have a response. What benefits would better implemented anti-money laundering and anti-corruption strategies or policies have for Pacific Island states?
Shall I go first?
Go ahead, John.
I think that, as Marie mentioned, we shouldn't underestimate the financial losses that occur in the Pacific through corruption, and particularly in the resource-rich states. The significant amount of money is leaving those states. So particularly for those states, I think it's hugely important if they're going to develop effectively and fairly. And we see this from the Pacific Barometer. Again, there is significant corruption. Beyond that, even in the states where the money laundering, the corruption is through the external money laundering, it has a real risk of corrupting the enforcement agencies within the state. And we've seen that in other parts of the world where states can actually be captured by or at extreme lengths by criminal entities, particularly when they're smaller states. That's even happens in parts of Europe. So we shouldn't underestimate the dangers that I think can occur in this issue.
Thank you, John. And while I have you, John, there's another question here on the Q&A for you. Is there a shared public registry of PEP between states in the Pacific, Australia and New Zealand included? And what are the barriers of having such a registry?
I think I'm going to hand this one over to Chat, who's the anti-money laundering expert.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. So either share the public registry for political exposure person between states in the Pacific, the barrier such. Well, I haven't been aware of this public register for the PEP between states in the Pacific. I think one of the barriers would be the sensitive, the sensitive problems would be occurred when we share the informations PEPs among the states. So there would be difficult to get a consensus among states, which what information should be shared, and and also those informations should be shared in what extent. So that is kind of very difficult to get the consensus. I think that would be the biggest barrier. Yeah.
Thank you, Chet. I'm going to read a question here from, just to acknowledge the chair of GOPAC, which is the Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption, Oceania, Lord Fustua. His question is the assessment of the researchers of this project regarding the utility and levels of application, if any, of the, and also to you, Marie, as well, of the Tenea vision, either in general or specific aspects, and did they observe if they were any formally incorporated into addressing this nexus between money laundering and corruption in Pacific nations? Any takers on that?
I'll go first. Somebody else should go. So I think the Tenea vision is a huge step forward. It doesn't, from memory, have a lot about the nexus between money laundering and anti-corruption within it. I'll have to double check again. But the other thing is, it's a very new. It's new off the blocks. We've got to see how the implementation. It was only accepted by the forum leaders last year. Personally, I think it's too early to make a call. The fact that it's been pushed forward and accepted by the leaders, to me, is a positive sign, and it does show that anti-corruption generally is moving up the political, is becoming more of a priority amongst the leaders. Because I think in the past, it's fair to say that the forum hasn't focused a lot on these issues. This shows a real shift. So I guess the time will tell whether. The proof of the pudding's in the eating. It depends how these things are implemented. But I think it's too early at this stage. As far as I'm aware, I think the priorities they're just in the process of developing the implementation plan at the present time. I may be slightly behind on this. Marie can probably comment. But so I think time is we'll see how this goes.
Yeah, fully correct, John. Indeed, the discussion is currently with the PIF and the members, the forum members, to look at the implementation plan and to look at what are the priority. I mean, the whole idea is to look at every priority, and there are several of them, and also to look at the NCAC recommendation and see what is achievable in the next year, and then to go forward from that. And yes, there is a recognition in the Tenea vision of the link between money laundering and the need to address money laundering and corruption in the region. So I think the time, it's already a year indeed since the adoption by the leaders, and it's moving towards the implementation. That's the most important, but it's the implementation is the hardest part. So this is what is starting now. Yes.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Marie. I am mindful of time, and I think we may, and I do apologize that we haven't been able to ask all of the questions. It's been quite a lot of interest through the questions that have been posed. So I'm going to just bring it down to two final questions. And this question is for UNODC. Is there any intention to try and reform or modernize MLAT processes? Sharing information is often timely, and getting that evidence in admissible format is the hard part.
I think this is really specific to investigation and money laundering on this one. I don't have the details on this specific question, but I can invite the person who posted this to send me an email, or to send an email to Julie, and I can try to get the information. I don't want to say something wrong there.
Thank you, Marie. And our last question, again to the panel, do you have any views on how effective the various efforts of regional FIUs to collaborate are, and whether these lead to operational improvements?
Yeah, I think I might start off in Fiji. Yeah, the Fijian government has recently passed legislation on beneficial ownership, in the sense that when an overseas company or local company registers in Fiji, that they would like to know the actual owners of this, rather than some anonymous group based in Panama or somewhere. So that has been brought on board. But how successful they are at the moment, I don't know. It's quite a complex area. As John Hopkins had mentioned, sometimes money launderers try to use respectful methods of laundering their money. This legislation has gone, but I'm not really sure how effective it is. Thank you.
Would anyone else like to also respond to that question?
Yeah, I would have a few comments on this question. Yes, so I think we have the Asia Pacific Association, FIU. I mean, so I think the association has 11 member countries. So it means that on paper, on paper we have a form of cooperation, but in practice, from our research, I can say that the actual cooperation in actual cases is quite limited, and most cooperation would be would be in the form of informal exchanges. Informal exchanges of information among FIUs. It's not. But actually, it is working. It is working. But that's we need resources. We need more promotion, and that would it improves the effectiveness. So I think it works, but we need to invest both resources and attention to the cooperation. So that's my few comments.
Thank you, Chad. Again, apologies, everyone, but I will end the questions here. I am mindful of time, and we do need to wrap up. Excuse me. But before I do hand it back to Julie, for some closing remarks, I just want to advise that we've put the link of the report in the chat, so you can access the report now. And also, I should have provided a brief introduction to Dr. Chat Nguyen, who is one of the authors and the lead researchers of the report. He brings a wealth of expertise in money laundering here in New Zealand and in the South Pacific region, and is acknowledged as New Zealand expert on money laundering in the Pacific. Prior to joining the Canterbury School of Law, Dr. Nguyen was a lecturer at the Fiji National University and latterly at the University of the South Pacific. He developed and lectured the courses on serious financial crimes, which includes corruption and money laundering, to both undergraduate and postgraduate students at the USP School of Law. So on that note, let me pass on to Julie for some closing remarks, and then we'll close things off for today. Malo.
Malo, Alfred, and thank you very much to our presenters and to everybody for attending, and to our MC. What I'm going to do now is to ask Peter Kelly, who's a member of the Transparency International Board, Transparency International New Zealand Board, to actually formally launch the report, which is available in the link. We do have a few hard copies, and I'll be sending those. Our aim is to get those out to the Pacific in the first instance, because that's where we want the influence to be. So I'll now hand over to Peter Kelly to formally launch the report and give the closing karakia. Thank you.
Got it, Julie. And look, thank you, everyone. And may I, on behalf of Transparency International New Zealand, commend the authors of this report for the effort that you've gone to put this all together. And it's a significant amount of work to get to this point. And look, can I thank all the participants as well? And hopefully you'll get a lot of understanding and a deep sort of nuance of the issues within the Pacific and here within New Zealand as well, as you work your way through this report. So thank you, everyone. And I will close with a karakia. Unu here, E te uru tapanui a tānei, kia wātia, kia mama, te nākau, te hinarau, te wairua, te tinana, e te ara takatu. E rongo whakaria ki rongo kia wātia, aira kua wātia hau, tūturu ki rongo whakamau kia tina, tina huie, tāri ki oi. Thank you, everyone, and I'll pass back to Alfred.
Kia ora, Peter, and thank you very much for closing us off in the appropriate way. If you wish to know more about Transparency International and in particular TINZ, you can see the contact details on the screen. And on that note, have a pleasant evening, everyone, and thank you so much for attending. Malo, soifua, mai manuia.